Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the National District Attorney Association's webinar this afternoon with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or our partners at the Cfpb. We are thrilled to have three great speakers with us this afternoon, and we're going to move pretty quickly into their presentation. Before doing so, I want to run through the ground rules for our attendees. First, on the housekeeping side, all attendees' microphones have been muted. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the question window below, where my arrow should be pointing now. Questions will be answered at the end of the session. If you experience any technical issues, please try to first log out and then back in, or close out any extra programs and browser windows, as these tend to eat up bandwidth. Finally, if you're still having issues, please refer to the number here, 833-851-8340, as the GoToWebinar help desk should be able to provide assistance. NDAA is offering several virtual learning opportunities in order to provide training opportunities for you all during this difficult time. You can visit NDAA.org to find these opportunities and trainings, and feel free to watch this NDAA training, which is being recorded and will be shown later and posted for all of our members. So now let's get to our speakers we are thrilled to have with us today. First, joining us from the CFPB is Jim Rice, Assistant Director for the Office of Servicemember Affairs at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Mr. Rice joined the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as the Assistant Director in the Office of Servicemember Affairs in March of 2019. He previously served as the Regional Administrator, Hearing Office Director, and the Office of Medicare Hearings and Appeals, OMHA, at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services from 2012 to 2017. From 2017 to 2019, he served as the OMHA as a Senior Advisor, focusing on electronic case processing. Prior to joining HHS, Mr. Rice served for over 3 decades in the U.S. Army. He initially served as an enlisted medic at Fitzsimmons and Letterman Army Medical Centers, followed by enlisted and commissioned service at the Wisconsin Army National Guard while completing his degree. Following his graduation from the ROTC program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Mr. Rice served for over 30 years in the Army Medical Service Corps as a medical evaluation officer. He commanded at every level from platoon to brigade and was the first Army Medical Department officer to command at both the battalion and brigade level in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Following brigade command, Mr. Rice served as the director of the U.S. Army Wounded Warrior Program for 3 years. In his final active duty assignment, Mr. Rice served as the Chief of Health Service Divisions on the Joint Staff. He is a graduate of the Army Medical Department Basic Course, the Aviation Officer Advanced Course, the Command and General Staff College, the Army War College, and the Federal Executive Institute. We're very thankful for Mr. Rice joining us today. Our second speaker is Tony Camille, the Policy and Outreach Analyst for the Office of Servicemember Affairs at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Prior to joining the CFPB, Tony worked in various roles at the U.S. Department of Labor. At DOL, he completed an interagency rotation as part of the President's Management Council. Prior to his work at DOL, Tony served on active duty for more than 7 years as a judge advocate in the Air Force Jack Corps. During his active duty service, Tony helped airmen with their personal legal matters, including many airmen who were victims of unscrupulous financial institutions. Tony's service took him on all corners of the globe. With a deployment to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Tony continues to serve in the Air Force Reserve, where he holds the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Our final speaker today will be Jennifer Dwayne, Senior Program Analyst in the Office of Older Americans. Jennifer Dwayne was appointed to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, in 2011, where she serves as the Senior Program Analyst in the Office of Financial Protection for Older Americans. She is the national lead of the Moneysmart for older adults and the Elder Fraud Prevention and Response Network programs. She also supports the office's work to develop resources and guidance for financial institutions and law enforcement on building collaboration for reporting and investing cases of financial exploitation. Ms. Dwayne's career in elder justice work spans more than 20 years. In 1999, she founded the Marin Bank Reporting Project to train bankers to report suspected elder financial exploitation. In 2001, she founded the nonprofit Elder Financial Protection Network in California. Under her leadership as the founder and CEO, EFPN developed awareness programs for older adults and family caregivers on preventing, identifying, and reporting elder financial exploitation. EFPN also developed award-winning professional training for the financial service industry, law enforcement, social and legal services, and other professions. In 2004, the California Attorney General presented her with an award for the outstanding service in elder abuse prevention. In 2009, she was presented with the FDIC's 75th Anniversary Chairman's Award for Excellence and Innovation in Financial Education. In 2019, the Moneysmart for Older Adult Programs was presented with the American Society on Aging Award for Excellence in Training and Education for Older Adults. Also in 2019, Ms. Dwayne was presented with the Cfpb Director's Mission Achievement Award for her leadership for the Elder Fraud Prevention and Response Network program. As you can tell from their bios, we are thrilled to be joined by three distinguished speakers. And now I'm excited to kick it to Mr. Jim Rice and have him begin his presentation. Jim, I will take you off mute and I will be sharing my screen with you shortly. You should have control of the screen now. And I believe you're still on mute, Jim, if you want to take yourself off. Oh, Jim, we still have you on mute. We can see your screen, but
I will have to catch up to see.
There we go.
There. And
15 minutes that I missed.
slides good? Or do you need the?
you can do the presenter view, Jim, and that will get you where you need to go. There we go.
Well, we're finally there. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for that introduction, Frank. We certainly do appreciate it. And it's our pleasure to be with you this afternoon for these presentations. First of all, the disclaimer, and this applies to all three of the Bureau employees who you'll be hearing from this afternoon. And really, this just says that what you're going to hear is not a legal interpretation or guidance from the Bureau, and that the opinions are of the presenters themselves. What we really want to do is take these presentations as a point of discussion, that the topics in here, both ours and in older Americans, are important to you, they're important to us, they're important to the community, and we want to make sure we're sharing topics that are important to all of us. So for the first part of the briefing, as you heard in the introductions, it is going to be myself, Jim Rice as the Assistant Director, and Tony Camille, who is a policy analyst and has been for some time with the Office of Servicemember Affairs. We count on Tony's expertise every day. That's an overview of the brief we're going to go through this afternoon. A little background on the office. We're going to talk about consumer complaints, military consumer protection laws, and as I mentioned, how we can help each other, what topics are important to both of us. And I think we've got time for some questions, and there's a procedure for you to enter those in the chat function. All right, number one, the Office of Servicemembers Financial Education Mission. OSA has a couple of statutory missions under the Dodd-Frank law. The OSA's first statutory mission is to educate and empower service members, veterans and their families, and those who serve them about financial products and services. We do that through a number of ways, like this webinar, for instance, or blog posts about hot topics, or creating educational brochures that provide accurate, thorough, and specific advice on hundreds of topics. I would also like to highlight a research paper that we published just a little over 2 weeks ago that has to do with credit use among young service members. We think there's information in there, and we've got in fact, we're already working on a follow-on report using that data. These brochures are available for order by consumers and stakeholders to ensure that everyone gets the most objective information that exists. And because we are part of the federal government, there's no cost to order any of these brochures and to do so in mass quantities. You can order them and have them shipped directly to your organization or to yourself at the website that you see on the slide. or you can email us at military@cfpb.gov, and we'll make sure to move those along. Right, the second part of the Office of Service Member Affairs mission is to monitor military consumer complaints. These are the complaints received by service members, veterans, and their families, what we call our military consumers. And I'll talk about in more detail in a little bit what some of those complaints are and what the categories are. OSA reviews every single complaint that we receive from military consumers. This is a map of the military consumer complaints from our most recent complaint report that covered from October 2018 through September of 2019. In past years, we still receive complaints from states, from states with the largest veteran populations, California, Texas, and Florida. The #1 complaint for military consumers has historically been debt collection, which is the same as the general population. But in FY19, the #1 topic was credit and consumer reporting. I will point out that since the beginning of the COVID-19, we have seen an increase both across the Bureau, a significant increase, and an increase among the military population as well. Our third statutory mission is to coordinate with other federal, state, and local government agencies on military consumer protection measures, which is what we are doing today and sharing this educational information with you. Some ways we've done that in the past. Our Servicemembers Civil Relief Act report on the problems of student loan servicing for deployed service members. Problem for the Department of Education. Our review of complaints regarding allotment abuses led to a DoD policy change that allotments cannot be used anymore to buy stuff, that is personal property, but instead should be used for functions like sending money to family, building up small savings accounts, and those kinds of things, more appropriate for the use of allotments. Now, how do consumer complaints help? One of the primary functions of the CFPB is collecting, investigating, and responding to consumer complaints. The Office of Consumer Response handles consumer complaints for the Bureau and analyzes and shares complaint data to level the playing field and empower consumers to take more control over their financial lives. The Bureau receives consumer complaints through its website, by telephone, by email, by mail, by fax, and by referral from a number of different government agencies, including the White House, congressional offices, and other federal and state agencies. When consumers submit complaints online or over the phone, the Bureau asks them to identify the consumer financial product or service with which they have a problem, as well as the type of problem they are having with the product or service. We do this for 2 reasons. First, we work to ensure that each complaint we receive, consumers get a response from the company or are connected to another resource for assistance. We can't solve every problem, but we work to make sure each consumer's voice is heard. Leads us to the second point, and that is that complaints provide us with insight into problems consumers are experiencing in the marketplace and help inform our work, help us decide which products we are going to further develop, what educational tools we're going to use, the next brochure to make. Protecting consumers' privacy is our priority. No personal information is shared publicly without that consumer's consent. Basic information about the complaint is published to a public database after the company that the complaint is filed about responds. They normally have 15 days to acknowledge the complaint, and within 60 days, the company provides a final answer. Permission of the complainant, that complaint is then scrubbed of any identifying information and added to our database. So who are the military consumers? We talked about that it is active duty military, it is reservists, family members, and veterans. On this slide, this is a screenshot of our online complaint portal showing some of the information that we ask for to help identify military consumers. As you see, all of the information fields are optional, but it is helpful to the Bureau to spot patterns and trends if military consumers tell us more information as to their base location, rank, and branch of service. As you'll see in the following slide, a significant number do not make that identification. Turning to our complaints data, as you see, our volume for military consumers has grown every year since we started our complaint system. And in FY19, the number of complaints plateaued with the FY18 number in excess of 34,000. As I mentioned earlier, our consumers can identify by branch and location. But you see here that almost a third, 29%, do not provide either their status, active, reserve, or veteran, or their branch of service. I'd also like to highlight that given the larger number of veterans compared to those who are currently in service, it's not surprising that almost 50% of our complaints come from that segment of the military consumer. And as you can see from this chart, the top 5 financial products comprise more than 75% of the entire complaint data set from FY19. At this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tony Camille, who's going to brief you on 2 important federal consumer protection laws.
Thank you, Jim, and we're going to get Tony on now. Tony, you should be good to go.
All right. Thanks very much for the handoff, Jim. And good afternoon, everybody. As Frank said, my name is Tony Camille. I'm a policy analyst with the Office of Service Member Affairs. And I'm going to be walking you through a couple of the specific military consumer financial protection laws that exist out there, just to be aware of, in case you come across a situation where you have someone who's in the military and might be being taken advantage of in some way financially. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, or the SCRA, and there's the statutory cites for you. And then the Military Lending Act, which is a more recent statute that was passed back in 2006. And there's the cites for you for the statute. And big difference here is that between the two is that the SCRA does not have any implementing regulations. It's just a plain forward statute. So everything that you need to know about the SCRA is contained within the statute itself, whereas the MLA does have implementing regs which get into much greater detail about how it functions. So with that being said, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is sort of the preamble for the SCRA, and I'm not going to sit here and read it word for word, but I think this is drawn directly from the statute itself. I do think that it's worthwhile quoting a case that from the U.S. Supreme Court back in the 1940s, where the court said that the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, back then it was actually called the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act, but the act itself must be read with an eye friendly to those who drop their affairs to answer their country's call. I think the Supreme Court said it best. That's the idea behind the SCRA. It's to really make sure that the troops in the front line of whatever environment they're in do not have to take their focus off of their warfighting efforts. Next slide. So the SCRA covers everybody who's in an active duty on the military side, but it also provides coverage for some other groups, and that's what this slide is to show you here. If you're a reservist and you get activated, you are then covered by the SCRA, although if you're not in an active capacity If you're just a reservist in inactive duty, as it's known, then you're not covered by the SCRA. Same goes for the National Guard, those members who are mobilized under federal orders for more than 30 consecutive days. The Act also covers active duty service members in the Public Health Service and the NOAA Corps. Those are two branches of the uniformed services. They're not armed forces. They're uniform services that wear uniform, in a lot of ways act in ways that are similar to the military, but they are not actually, they do not have combatant status for warfighting affairs. And then dependents of service members also have some rights that we'll get into in a little bit. And the last bullet here is just to let you know that the rights themselves can also be invoked by someone who holds a valid power of attorney. So for example, if you've got somebody there's a member of the military who's on the front lines and is unreachable, and there's something happening back in their home front that they cannot attend to, as long as somebody back in the home front has a valid power of attorney, they can step in the shoes of the service member, and they are able to use the SCRA to protect that service member in the same way as if the service member were there, him or herself. Next slide. So see, these are some of the basic protections that the SCRA provides. And I'm not going to get into too much detail. They're pretty self-explanatory, but just want to point out a couple of important points buried, that I have in my notes here. So the biggest, the biggest protection that I think that really is most helpful for people in the military is the protection against default judgments. Although the one I think that gets the most use is probably the first bullet point, which is allows service members to lower any sort of pre-service loans to a maximum 6% interest rate. In a different world, back when mortgage rates used to be 15%, that was a big deal for people who came in the military. Nowadays, it's more likely to be used for people who have credit card debt who come in the military, people who have auto loans that are in sort of the subprime category, which tend to be higher than 6%. And so the idea here is that if you have this loan before you enter the military, you are able to get it reduced to 6% during your military service. And that can be for the duration of service. That could be as little as, if you're signed a 3-year enlistment contract, or if you're in 20 or even 30 years, as long as Jim served. During that entire time, the financial institution that's lending you whatever product they have has to reduce that loan to 6%. And it's not deferred interest. It is forbeared interest. They can never collect that additional interest. If you had a credit card, it was 18%, they can never come back at you and try and collect that extra 12% that they didn't get for 10 years or however long you were on active duty. So that's one thing to note there. The default judgment one is, I think, is particularly important for people in uniform, because if you're downrange or overseas or someplace where it takes forever to get mail, at least from the United States, then you may not get notice of something in the mail regarding like a default judgment against you or a court action for months after it happens. And in that case, the whole point of this is to protect you in that environment, to make sure that there can be no such thing as a default judgment. You have to get your day in court. You have to have the chance to sort of represent yourself however you so choose. It's a pretty powerful thing. Essentially, though, creditors can still, there is a way to comply with this. They have to show the court that they made a good faith effort to find you. If they can prove to a court they made a good faith effort to find you, then the court does have the ability to say that they complied with the act if that good faith effort was made. What that good faith effort looks like is dependent upon the circumstances of each individual case. But generally speaking, that means they have to really try to reach the service member. So every communication method or system you can think of, they need to sort of prove to the court they made an effort there and that the service member was non-responsive. A couple other things to talk about here is, in addition to the default protection for default judgments, another one that gets used quite a bit, another basic protection for the troops, is the termination of housing and auto leases without penalty. Like most people in America, the troops, when they move around, they get forced to move around because they're on orders. they usually find housing in the community. The younger troops tend to find housing on base, but the older population, especially those with families, are often off the military installation, and they need to find a place to rent, a house, apartment, what have you. Well, sometimes they get orders that are not in alignment with their date that they signed their lease. So they signed a 1-year lease, and they arrive there, and 6 months later they get orders to go deploy somewhere fast. The SCRA has this built-in protection, allows them to terminate those leases without penalty. Now, I'll mention later is the Department of Justice is the enforcer of the SCRA. They have the litigation authority, and they have taken on quite a few cases in this area in landlord-tenant law, which is something that's really tricky because typically that is the province of state courts. Very rarely do federal courts get involved in anything related to landlord-tenant law. But in this case, when it comes to the SCRA and how that impacts the troops, the Department of Justice has brought cases in federal court for that reason. So those are kind of the big rocks of the SCRA, or the big highlights. Again, I made this list is to cover kind of most of the basic protections, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of those. One last thing I'll mention here before moving on is that, and this is something that we've seen a little bit in the past couple of years, is that institutions that are required to comply with the SCRA are trying to get around it a lot of times by doing waivers. And unfortunately, the way the law is currently written, the SCRA, troops can waive their rights. And as you might imagine, typically that waiver is done in some sort of boilerplate fashion, where the troop is not really paying attention to what they're reading and what they're signing. And so that can create a circumstance where they have actually signed away their SCRA rights and not have known it. The law itself, the way it's written, it does provide that all waivers have to be written. The waivers have to be in at least 12-point font, which I find fascinating. They put that in a law because clearly that's a showing that a lot of this stuff is written in 8 to 10-point font that nobody without a microscope can read. And also the waiver must be an actual written document that is signed by the service member. It must be its own document. It cannot be part of the original contract. So, for example, a service member signs a lease for an apartment. It can't just be buried in the lease itself to say they waive their SCRA rights. It actually has to be a separate written document where the waiver occurs. And that's right in the statute. That's section 3918. All right. That being said, I'm going to move on. Talk a little bit about the MLA. Now, the Military Lending Act is a different special protection statute, and I'm not going to read it to you here, but this is straight out of the implementing regulation that the Department of Defense is the responsible party for writing and drafting and interpreting. And so essentially, it's to what we in the parlance of this world consider the MLA is it's a usury law statute. It is essentially a federal level usury law that prohibits lending to service members and their dependents above a certain interest rate. There are a fair number of exemptions, however, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So not quite as a robust usury law as some of the states have. For example, I know that New York State has a pretty strong usury law. There's quite a few other states on the books that have usury laws that are even more protective of their citizens than the MLA is. But the MLA, to my knowledge, is the only federal level usury law that exists at this point in time. Next slide, please. So what's the limit? We're going to talk that right up front. It's a 36% limit on any loan that is subject to the MLA. We in this business refer to that as the military APR or MAPR, if you want to call it that. But basically, everyone's familiar with that phrase. What is the APR on a loan or any type of credit? That lovely acronym and phrase has been brought to us through the Truth in Lending Act, which is another law that the Cfpb enforces. And when the drafters created the Military Lending Act, they decided to use a similar name, except they just threw military in front of it. But there's the loan limit. There it is spelled out in the regulation. And it has some other, the MLA has a couple other basic protections. So all disclosures have to be both written and oral. as well as there's a preemption part of it here that says it preempts all other state laws. Anything that's inconsistent, but anything that provides a higher level of protection still accrues to the benefit of the troops. And then this is important. There are no waiver of any federal or state legal rights under other laws with the MLA. So this is where it can get a little tricky in the sense that somebody who is a service member who is borrowing money, and if that loan is subject to the MLA, there can be no waiver of their SCRA rights in that MLA loan. So they would then, so what it does is it makes sure that to preserve all of their rights under the MLA as well as their rights under the SCRA. There is no way that can be waived under the MLA, but that's only for transactions that fall under the MLA. And so there are quite a few exemptions and carve-outs we're going to get into. Next slide. This is probably my favorite MLA protection right here. Is the top one, is there's no requirement to use arbitration. And if anybody has any background and knowledge about the current state of arbitration in this country, this is a pretty big one for the troops, because there's been a lot of research, there's a lot of data to show that more and more consumer contracts have arbitration clauses in a mandatory arbitration. And I'm not going to make a judgment as to whether or not arbitration is a good or a bad thing, but what it does here in the MLA, they made sure to say that you can't force the troops to go to arbitration. Their day in court, their right to go to court or take a legal action is preserved. And I think that's a pretty important thing, especially for troops who happen to be involved in disputes on a small scale level. People in the military tend not to have significant resources behind them to be able to bring lawsuits. And so this preserves the ability of people in uniform to bring class action. And sometimes that is the best way to bring an action when you're talking about a transaction that affects a large group of people, but in small amounts. Some other here basic protections. There's no mandatory allotments. Jim mentioned that earlier, that we've sort of worked with DOD to make some policy changes on how you use allotments over the past couple of years. This here in the MLA precludes the lender from using allotments to repay them. And prior to this, a lot of lenders would say that, you want to set up a loan with us, that's great, but you got to have it come directly out of your paycheck through an allotment, as opposed to the money first hitting your bank account and then you turning around and paying us. This takes that out of the equation and lets the service member choose how to do that, how to make those payments. All right, next slide. So these are the loans that are covered by the MLA. Like I said, this is where we get some we're going to talk in a minute about some exemptions, but these are the primary, when Congress wrote the law, these were the primary things they were trying to cover. The number one, I think that number one loan category that some would say is most impacted is the payday lending industry. And that's probably, I would say it's probably true only because the APR rates tend to be a little higher on loans like that. With payday lending, we're talking about short-term, unsecured, small dollar loans. And typically payday loans are ones that are made to people with lower credit ratings. And so the APRs can rise very quickly on those types of loans. And so it's very important, at least from Congress's standpoint, that we preclude the troops from getting payday loans that are that exceed that 30% cap, 36% cap. And then the other categories of loans here, important to note, some of these loans are typically not over a 36% rate anyway. I have yet to hear of a student loan that, for example, that was over 36%, but that, the point being here is that this is a written in law. And so that if that industry changes, if student lending changes to the point where it gets to that level, the troops will still have the protection of the cap. And I think credit cards is probably another area where you can sometimes see APRs are above 36% because it's driven essentially by the credit rating of the applicant. Next slide. Now to the loans that are not covered. So anything business related, no business loans are covered. If service members are running a side business, which a lot of them are doing, I've read and heard about many times. Mortgage loans are not covered. Again, though, we haven't had, to my knowledge, in my lifetime, anything approaching a 36% normal baseline rate for a mortgage, but they are not covered anyway. And then when you're buying a vehicle, if you are buying a vehicle on credit and basically if that's a secure transaction, that is also exempt from the MLA. And then same thing goes with personal property that is a secured transaction. Some people often ask, like, what does that look like, a loan for personal property? Don't people just use credit cards normally? And I would say the answer is usually yes, but sometimes people buy things like appliances on credit, and that might be a secured transaction that the loan is secured by the appliance itself. Furniture is another example that fits nicely in this category. Some people buy furniture and credit from stores. It really comes down to whether or not the property is secured by the loan itself. If it is personal property and secured, it is unfortunately not covered by the MLA. And so there could be paying a rate higher than 36%. And then a few other here that I'm not going to get into too much detail, but there's a couple other loans. The couple of loans that are exempt from the Truth in Lending Act, those also are exempt from the MLA. And next. So if you ever come across, I'll just say from the standpoint of from what we at the CFPB want to know, we help to enforce the MLA. We have that authority legally to enforce the MLA. So with exception of the top bullet point here, any type of nefarious behavior related to a loan involving the troops, there is the ability to prosecute criminally for that. And so I have an asterisk up there because that first asterisk is that's under Title 18. So that part of the CFR there, 232.9A, takes you out and talks about the enforcement authority of the DOJ through Title 18. So they retain that authority to prosecute criminal matters. We do not have that jurisdiction or authority. But everything else here are areas for which the CFPB and some of the other financial regulators have the ability to, these are just some of the remedies that we can bring in an enforcement action for the MLA. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the last bullet point. And this is, there's also a private cause of action under the MLA. And so that really ties in well with the last bullet point, because if you bring a private cause of action under the MLA, you can get your attorney's fees and court costs covered if you are successful in that action. However, unlike a lot of statutes, there's also the ability for the defendant to get attorney's fees and court costs if the court finds that the action was brought in bad faith. And I think that was driven by by Congress's intent to make sure that the act was used only for cases that merit that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, criminal misdemeanors, the Department of Justice is the enforcing authority for that. There's the private cause of action, and there's the CFR sites for you. And then civil enforcement, these are the agencies, and it's like an alphabet soup of government here, I understand that, but these are the agencies that have civil enforcement authority under the MLA. So technically, there are some of our sister regulators. They're all shown here: the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Reserve Bank, the National Credit Union Administration, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Federal Trade Commission. We all together have civil enforcement over the MLA. I have not yet witnessed a scenario where there was a question as to who was sort of had the primary jurisdiction over the matter. So I can't say as to what would happen in that environment. But point being is that we definitely within CFPB want to know anytime there's a potential MLA violation out there, because we want to talk to our team. We want to sit down and review the facts, see if there's worth looking at an investigation, and if so, our legal team will decide whether to take it forward. Next slide. So in this next slide, what I want to illustrate here is why this is important. This is actually an infographic that was the FTC put together not too long ago in 2019. And this is based on some of the complaints that they've received through their Consumer Sentinel network, which is shown there as the source. But one thing that really jumps out at you here is that these are reported cases of fraud that they have been tracking from the people who are claiming to have been defrauded. And it's really sticks out here when you look at the numbers here for, civilians as opposed to everybody else in America, whereas retirees and the veterans and active duty seem to be taken advantage of at higher levels. We can't speculate as to why that is, but that's why this is important, that we need to have strong partnerships with federal, state, and even local government agencies to help us find and work this stuff out. In other words, the more you know about this, the more you can let us know about it, and the more we might be able to help try and drive these numbers down. But oftentimes we're not aware of this stuff happening until we get some sort of notice from the actual consumer who happens to be in the military. Next slide, please. And so this ties in with this, how we can help each other again. We know from our work that sometimes a transaction that's questionable, that looks like fraud, sometimes it implicates federal law, sometimes it implicates state law, sometimes it implicates both. But that's why these relationships and these partnerships are so vital and important, because if we know about it, we're talking to each other about it, then we can try and do something. We can look at our different authorities, our different abilities, and to see how we can try and collaborate on trying to, if not prevent these transactions from happening, at least try and remedy them or rectify them through a lawsuit. And the Bureau has been pretty successful at this. In the time that I've been at the Bureau, we have opened up countless number of investigations that were done in conjunction with a state authority, either a state banking authority or a state attorney general's office, where we opened up, parallel investigations due to a matter. And sometimes the behavior, in fact, violates both a federal law and a state law, and we might, in fact, work together on fining or bringing a lawsuit in either federal and/or state court. So it's very important that we work together and we stay connected and talk about these things. So next slide. And how do you do that? Well, we've got a couple ways to do that. Jim mentioned earlier our military at cfpb.gov account. That's our organizational account for our team in Service Member Affairs. Please, if you want to reach out to us or talk to us about anything at all, that's the best and easiest way to get to us. And then probably less desirable for this group, they're more of our public facing pages, but we have a Facebook site, we have a Twitter page for people to reach out and talk to us there. And then if you want to just sort of like keep in the know without having, just sort of know what we're up to on a regular basis, you just send us an email to our military at cfpb.gov account and say, add me to your email list. We can go ahead and add you to our Gov Delivery, as it's called, our Gov Delivery list. And anytime we are taking action on something important or releasing a study or a research report or what have you, you automatically get that sent to your inbox so you can take a look at it and you can decide whether that's helpful for you in your practice. And I think that's all I've got for us in Service Member Affairs. I think at this point, Frank, we'll turn it over to our colleague Jennifer. But
Great.
Thanks very much for your time today, everyone.
Thank you, Tony. And Jennifer, you should be unmuted, so please begin when you're ready. And I'm going to pass you the presentation as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody.
And Jennifer, you should have the presentation.
Okay. I will click on this little prompt.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. Hope everything's in order. Thank you so much, Tony and Jim, my colleagues from the Bureau, and also to the National District Attorneys Association and our great helpers here on the line. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today and have the opportunity to share information resources. I have a lot of info to share in a short time period, so fasten your seatbelts and we'll get going. There we go. So this is me. I was introduced earlier. Thank you very much, Frank, for that, and I'll just carry on. I represent the Office for Older Americans. We work to protect older people from financial harm and to help them make sound financial decisions as they age. We have lots of resources at consumerfinance.gov/ elder/older Americans. I'll probably say that a few times during the presentation. The focus of this today, and I'll just scoot back real quick, is elder fraud prevention and response, building collaboration between stakeholders and also sharing resources to fight elder financial exploitation. So I will just carry on. So in 2016, we released a report on community networks nationwide. You, National District Attorney Association, your DAs throughout the nation may participate in these networks, which are sometimes known as multidisciplinary teams, financial abuse specialist teams, elder death review teams, and various coalitions, task forces, and alliances, and even leagues, elder justice leagues, that work on a multidisciplinary level to combat elder financial exploitation. And we wrote a report, Fighting Elder Financial Exploitation Through Community Networks, that you can access through the website. One way we work on the issue is by supporting the development and implementation of stakeholder networks that work collaboratively with multidisciplinary representatives to prevent and respond to elder financial exploitation. We are obviously very clear that elder financial exploitation is a form of elder abuse. However, being a financial institutions regulatory agency, we do focus on the financial side, but I just want you to know that we are abundantly clear that this is a form of elder abuse. And throughout the nation, the stakeholders that are working together in many forms are collaborating often on a voluntary basis. They're often working on their lunch hours or without FTEs assigned, etc. It can be quite challenging, but we see a huge growth in networks across the country, and this, we believe, is the key to collaboration and response in the future. Well, right now. So what is a network? It's sustained because it's not a one-time event or meeting. We use the word network as a catch-all for all the other types I mentioned. The efforts are largely voluntary from formation to operation. There are important distinctions in our definition of a network from mandated multidisciplinary teams or other interagency protocols. These are, as I mentioned, known as task forces, coalitions, multidisciplinary teams, financial abuse specialist teams, and then, of course, elder death review teams often, sadly, find that there was a financial motive behind the older person's death. Should they find any suspicious activity at all, but when they do, often that is the case. Networks engage in a variety of activities ranging from education and advocacy, including case consultation and review. Many of the networks that we studied in 2016 focused on the abuse of vulnerable adults, also of all ages, and some focused just specifically on the suspicious deaths of the elder death review team. Some of the highlights of our findings in our study was that for older adults and professionals and communities, the networks that we studied found that cases there was an increase in the reporting of cases through community education and awareness, that there was improved response to cases of financial exploitation. The members' skills were enhanced and their capacity to address financial exploitation was increased. And that overall there was just improved coordination, including the use of victim services and other community resources. So basically, by coming together and learning about each other and building relationships, it helps to increase interagency referral, it increases early interventions, and it also increases the use of community services and resources, which is good for all of the resources, but really especially good for older people who need help and don't know how to reach it or are too isolated or otherwise compromised to advocate for themselves. Also, our study found that financial exploitation networks should implement strategies if they can. Sometimes that's a financial strategy to institutionalize the coordinator role as a permanent staff position, and to engage in educational activities, community education and prevention work. And when they have limited resources, which most networks do, they can use existing federal, state, and local educational resources. And I'll go over a few of those at the end. So as the population of older people is growing, they, meaning we, almost next here, are generally starting to kind of congregate in senior living communities and in retirement communities, retirement areas, and it helps very much to create and enhance existing networks, either create new networks or enhance existing networks in these areas where there is a large population of older people, but coordination does not exist. And we have actually been working to help with some of those efforts. And in doing so, in 2017, we launched a program to plan and facilitate training retreats. And we did this in 9 states to help initiate the creation of networks, to enhance the effectiveness and capacity of existing networks, and to learn for ourselves what resources we could create to further facilitate the development of these collaborative efforts. So here are some of the recommendations from the study. I think notably, you can read the PowerPoint, but networks should seek to engage financial institutions along with community-based organizations such as faith organizations and others that serve communities of older people. And of course, always looking for opportunities to develop networks of resources or collaboration with services and providers to older Americans of diverse linguistic, ethnic, and racial backgrounds as well. The underserved, as we often refer to them, and those that are typically more isolated as a result of their cultural or differences or racial backgrounds, etc. Next, we developed a resource guide for elder fraud prevention response networks. I am going to kind of skip over this really quickly because we've since developed a more comprehensive guide, but this is available, and it's a good read. It's not a long read, but it's a good read, and it will give you some great ideas. But we have a very recent release that I would like to share with you, and you have this PowerPoint, and we'll be able to look yourself. So as I mentioned, we worked on launching a pilot to expand the presence of networks across the country and also the capacity. We developed a model for identifying potential networks and coordinating with key stakeholders, facilitating meetings, and garnering support and often engagement from financial institutions, legal services, law enforcement, adult protective services. You know who they are. I often refer to them as the usual suspects. So hundreds of communities across the country have collaborated to create networks to help prevent and respond to elder financial exploitation. They typically involve the usual suspects, as I mentioned, but using our model from the 9 convenings, we created a network development guide. And we also wrote a report called Convening Communities to Build Elder Fraud Prevention and Response Networks. So you can actually read about 5 of the 9 projects that we did in communities around the country, often, almost always partnering with local and regional law enforcement, local law enforcement being our first responders, and of course our prosecutors being all of you, and then of course the AG's offices, the United States Attorney's offices where the elder justice coordinators are housed, and then any federal law enforcement in the area that is available, such as United States Postal Inspectors, FBI, et cetera, et cetera. So here's a quick peek at the cover of the report on Convening Communities to Build. which talks about common activities, replicating and expanding, convening stakeholders, some outcomes from our pilots, and more recommendations. But what I've been leading up to is this, just on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, June 15th, we released, actually it was a week before, but it's a shame that it's just a day. It actually needs to be an entire month. So we took a week, and we're still rolling out as we speak, and we'll continue. So the Network Development Guide is an online resource that helps to build an elder fraud prevention and response network by mobilizing key stakeholders. And you can find, well, if I had a little more time, I might try to access the toolkit itself, the development guide itself online. But I think because we're a little tight, I'm just going to plunge on. But here's why we developed the guide. We discovered along the way in our 9 training events, our 9 training retreats and convenings, that many of you, you're just so busy with your stuff. Everybody's busy, busy, busy. And especially in these times of COVID, it's even harder to squeeze more time to pull people together. And it's very hard to do. And you may have already pulled together a network, and keeping it going right now for some is very difficult. And others are finding it that working remotely is actually increasing their engagement. But regardless, those that already have a network or who would like to establish a network, we found would benefit from detailed instruction to help them either launch a network, a new network in a community where they don't have one, or to build capacity and collaboration in the existing networks to enhance prevention and response. We found that stakeholders like yourselves already have full-time jobs and could just use a turnkey resource to plan, produce, and host a training retreat, or to reconvene a MDT, FAST team, or other type of coalition, and to revisit priorities, etc., and chart a path forward. And we found that almost all networks really appreciate finding resources and guidance to establish and or maintain the network thereafter. So here's a quick look at the toolkit. It has 4 major sections, and I say toolkit, development guide. One part is planning a retreat, which is it's anywhere from a 60 to 90 day or longer process. You can make it smaller. If you have an existing network, it may not take as long. But if you're starting from scratch, we recommend a minimum of 90 days. So there are planning tools. Then there is the actual how to host the retreat, then how to reconvene afterwards and either move forward with your existing group and or establish a new network. And then also for those that are already have a footprint, expanding your capabilities. There's a whole section on how to do that. And you can see on the right the opportunity to connect with us to build a network. So if you have questions, and especially since I'm moving so quickly through this today, you can reach us by email, eldernetworks@cfpb.gov, eldernetworks@cfpb.gov. And you have the slides, so I won't spell it out for you. So the areas of focus I've already run through. We'll keep moving here. We have planning templates, lots and lots of templates. One of the favorite templates is that I'm hearing in feedback from those who have accessed this guide already is the stakeholder spotlight. It's like, who do I invite or who don't I have? And so we have put a lot of effort into identifying potential stakeholders to invite. And I must say that this will vary from area to area. If you are in an urban area, you will probably have most of the stakeholders on the list, presumably. But if you're in a very rural area, you may not have an outpost for your postal inspectors or your FBI or whatnot. They may be located in a more urban area. But they're there. The stakeholder list is there, and it is, and it describes all the different stakeholders. And by the way, even if they don't come to your meetings, they can make great trainers. They can be wonderful guest speakers, even of course remotely. There's a timeline tool to help you plan your meetings. We have sample invitations, email invitations, sample reminders, sample agendas. We have just a lot of help in there, and they're all downloadable. They're all PDFs that you can just download. And I want to say it's totally customizable. You can do whatever you need with it. It is not proscriptive. We do not say start here and do these things. You can go through and pick and choose what you think will work for your community, for your group, for your local culture, etc. We just wanted to provide, and you can change any of these templates, by the way. If you don't like them or you want to change them up into something different, go for it. They are totally publicly available. Okay, and we have a retreat facilitator guide that helps facilitators plan and execute the event. And the event is usually a morning event or a half-day event, the way we have it structured, 3.5 hours or thereabout, with activities and group exercises and outputs. You're able to record outputs, and we have the tools in there for you to do some voting exercises, etc. Highly recommend that you have an independent or neutral facilitator. That way you can all just sit down together with your bankers, with your legal assistance folks, with your adult protective services folks, your senior service providers, any of the stakeholders present, and you don't have to worry about running the meeting. Sorry, I just had to grab a slip of water there. And by not running the meeting, you're also engaging, and it also sort of takes the edge off of, ownership in a way, and makes it a more neutral and level playing field for all stakeholders to roll up their sleeves and work together. So there's lots of guidance around that. And then there's, as I mentioned, lots of additional tools and templates, such as supply lists, various handouts for participants, the voting sheets, etc. All right, I'm really going to get going faster now because I see we're a little past time. So there's all kinds of tools, resources for cross-training, then resources for networks. We have a program called Moneysmart for older adults. If one of the priorities of your network is to do more community education and outreach, have a look at this program, Moneysmart for older adults. We developed it in collaboration with the Fdic. It contains a resource guide for consumers in 14-point font, I might add. So it's very easy reading. It's all plain language, of course, but it's common frauds and scams, and then various tips for preventing, of course, where to report, and some activities in the guide to help people self-assess and engage with the program. It can be an instructor-led curriculum. There is an instructor guide, but also the resource guide stands alone. And as Jim was mentioning earlier, you can order those resource guides and everything we have free of charge, postage included, hundreds at a time for distribution either to events or individually or through your offices, lobbies, libraries, you name it. They are available to you. And almost all of our items in the office for older Americans, almost all of our resources are available in English and Spanish. So there's where you find the instructor guide and the resource guide. You can check back on that later since you have the PowerPoint. We have some wonderful guides called Managing Someone Else's Money. This is for lay fiduciaries, financial caregivers who are non-professionals. These are guides for people who are taking on the duties of being an agent of power of attorney, a guardian or a conservator, trustee, or as the POAs often find themselves, they are also the Social Security or the Veterans Affairs government benefit representatives. So those two, the first and last bullet point, often run hand in hand. So these are guides for financial caregivers on how to manage someone else's money. But I also just want to submit to you that these are also very good to hand out to older people so that they know what's involved with appointing a person to be your fiduciary. Because as many of you know, if you've had any experience with elder financial exploitation, this is one of the greatest vulnerabilities, is First of all, having some cognitive impairment perhaps, but even without cognitive impairment, it is that people are talked into signing over their financial control to a fiduciary who does not have their best interests in mind, and that is something that should be avoided at all costs, of course, no pun intended. And sometimes when older people realize what's involved in these duties, they're a little bit more careful about how they choose, or it is easier for them to say no when somebody approaches them who they would prefer not to have. Someone who perhaps has a history of drug, alcohol abuse, may have a history of gambling problems, or may just not be a good money manager, or some other issue. Okay, we have a manual for assisted living and nursing facilities, and this is just to help the facilities to avoid the situation where older people are dropped off, a fiduciary family member has taken over their finances, and then they don't pay the bill, and the older person gets evicted. So this is a guide for the administrators of assisted living and nursing facilities. So keep that in mind if you wish to share those around your community. And here's a little bit more on the manual, helping the operators and staff protect residents. I think that's enough to say for now. We have a planning for retirement tool. This is, great for older people who are thinking about retiring. So, and it's also good for people who perhaps have retired but haven't started collecting Social Security yet. But I put this up here just for you, as you all are looking forward to your own retirements. I hope not too soon, because we need you. But if you should be planning for retirement, this is a very good tool to give you an idea of when you should or might want to consider drawing on your Social Security and the benefits for not doing so. This is another great resource. We have fraud prevention placemats, and these are generally distributed to congregate meal sites, but they also go out to senior fraud prevention events, etc. But please keep in mind that they do not need to have a plate on top of them. They are perfectly fine for rolling up and tucking into a Meals on Wheels delivery program. They are great at conferences. They're not, they can be passed out anywhere, anytime. Older people love to have nice, large print information in small bites like this that they can look at and learn. And many of these placemats, I think there's 15 or 16 of them, lots of different frauds and scams, many of them have wonderful activities on them, like crossword puzzles and bingo, etc. That's all fraud-based, that makes the learning fun and only takes a few minutes to raise their awareness. Next, we have guides like how to consider whether a reverse mortgage is right for you or not. And part of the reason you might want to consider that is because of unfair, deceptive, and abusive marketing practices that are rampant in that marketplace. But the other reason is that someone may be trying to talk an older person into taking out a reverse mortgage to take a lump sum payout or something that is not in the elder's benefit. So this again is very simple, has a little simple checklist for older people. We also have Know Your Financial Advisor, which is great for older people to double check on their financial advisor, but it's great for all of us who are planning. We too are consumers, and we need to look out for ourselves and then spread the word to older people. And we actually have quite a number of guides and simple consumer-facing pieces like this that are easy reading, large font, and will help people to make sound financial decisions and protect themselves from financial exploitation. Pension lump sum payouts are a huge issue out there. We have a discussion guide on reverse mortgages. And again, this may not be your forte specifically to you district attorneys or state attorneys that are listening in, law enforcement, but perhaps you would share these resources or knowledge of these resources with your local network or with local elder justice advocates or people who are in senior services, et cetera, so that they can share with older people and family caregivers. So here's another long list of all the good stuff that you have access to. Obviously, we just talked about preparing. There's information on asset recovery scans. The co-signing of student loans is huge for older people. Sometimes older people are getting strapped with student loans and they're retiring and they're stuck with predatory student loans. Pension advance, dealing with medical debt, planning for diminished capacity. This is huge, and we all need to be doing that no matter what your age. Diminished capacity is not always from Alzheimer's and dementia. It can be from a head injury. It could be a temporary situation because of a surgery or some other, and it's actually kind of a big deal nowadays in the era of COVID, where people are unable to manage their affairs because they have been stricken by an illness. And this also speaks to disaster preparedness. We've been thinking about disaster preparedness for years as natural disasters, earthquakes, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, hazardous material spills, all true. But now we have to think about, pandemic as being a potential disaster that we need to prepare for financially. I will move on. We're really close here. We have a tool called Ask Cfpb. Tony may have mentioned it. It's slipping me at the moment. Consumerfinance.gov Ask Cfpb. This is about 1,000 questions on all things financial. It's for people of all ages, but there are a number of questions that address issues for older people and family caregivers, ranging from Social Security to financial exploitation to everything we've talked about, and then some, I would imagine. And Tony talked about the ability to submit complaints about financial products and services. This goes for older people and all different types of products and services. And I want you to know that you, district attorneys, you can, and legal services and adult protective services can file a complaint to the CFPB on behalf of an older person. And to keep it really simple for older people, they can call the number and have their complaint taken over the phone. But you can go to consumerfinance.gov/complaint. The form is online, and there's a box in there somewhere about checking that you are filing on behalf of another person. And in the case of older people, sometimes they are just not able to make the call for themselves, or they may lack the ability to be able to articulate what's happening to them. And that can happen even without diminished capacity. Sometimes it's just overwhelming and difficult when you are being railroaded by a bad actor. And again, email us. We have several email addresses, but I'm going to direct you to this one, Eldernetworks@cfpb.gov. If you are interested in more information, if you're interested in training, if I confused you at all about anything, I get these emails, and so just send along. If you'd like to be on a mailing list to receive occasional information from us, we do not flood your inbox, but we do send out blogs on releases and training opportunities, and we have lots of other stuff. I think that there is a document that I sent in, I hope, with a link to all sorts of resources, including our recommendations and resources and guidance for financial institutions, which maybe doesn't sound like it's for you, but if you are trying to work with financial institutions around elder financial exploitation, it's for you, because it's good for you to know what we are saying to financial services, financial banks, banks and credit unions, I would say depository institutions mostly, about financial exploitation, what they should be doing, what they should be considering, and of course, how to collaborate with all of you. And if any of you have access to suspicious activity reports, you'll be really interested in our report on suspicious activity reports on elder financial exploitation. We released it last year. We analyzed 170,000 SARs on elder financial exploitation, and we created a report on the results. And some of those numbers are very, very interesting and very telling. So in the meantime, find us, consumerfinance.gov. You can scroll down to practitioner resources and you'll find resources for older adults. Email me. And most of all, just thank you so much for all the great work you do out there. And thank you to you and or your colleagues who are working to protect older people, engaging in networks, collaborating, and I will leave it there.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to all three of our presenters. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but we really felt that it was worth, and especially since we're capturing all of this, to make sure that you all were able to present fully. So from there, I do think we'll have to move on unless I have an immediate question. But since it doesn't seem so, I just want to end by thanking all of our presenters for taking the time today. This was incredibly helpful for us as an organization and for our membership, and we look forward to spreading this message across our membership and to all of the state's attorneys and prosecutors we represent at NDAA. So again, thank you to all of our friends at the CFPB, and we appreciate your willingness to join us, and we hope to hear and see you all again soon. With that, we will. Thank you.